And we are live on the Venture to Victory podcast. I'm Tim Tonella, your host, CEO of MatchStar Venture Search. We look at the entrepreneurial journey from funding to exit. And in that context, I am so pumped today. We have George Northup in the house, an old friend. And George is really someone special because he has been around for many decades. Is kind of like the village elder with all the wisdom who's kind of seen it all. He's been personally involved as both an operator and an investor and executive, doing private equity deals. He's been involved in the venture community. He's sold companies to strategic investors or buyers. And he has also been involved in a public offering that was very, very successful. So, George, we're going to talk a little bit today about your background, your history, kind of what you're seeing in the Silicon Valley and kind of how things have changed. But before we get off, I want to tee this up with a little bit of an intro. So George has, again, been an executive and an advisor for over 25, primarily to B2B SaaS companies, but also other broader tech as well. He's built 4 companies that today have gone on to generate well over $5 billion in cumulative revenues. He's been involved in raising over $500 million in capital in the form of private equity, venture capital, and venture debt, as well as money that was generated through a public offering. And he's worked with a lot of the Silicon Valley's top VCs. You've heard the names: Kleiner Perkins, Draper, DFJ, SoftBank, to name a few. And he's actually had 4 exits that include a significant IPO that was underwritten by JP Morgan. And today, George can be found bumming around the Silicon Valley, helping all kinds of companies. George's specialty is venture turnaround. So companies that are struggling, having some challenges, balance sheet, cap table issues, sometimes operational inefficiencies, and with a strong financial background and having been an EVP and a CFO multiple times over, he would come in to try to figure out what are some of the things that you can do to put that company back on a proper path. And he's done that working with the boards directly, working with the founders directly. And we're excited to touch on that today.
Tim, good to see you today. And I'm delighted to talk about my background experience and share some of my thoughts with you.
That's awesome. I do want to go into a couple of the deals just before we start, because I think they are pretty cool. At one time, George had been the EVP and CFO of Live Capital. It was eventually sold to Dun & Bradstreet, DNB. George started when the company was close to zero, and they had successfully made that sale to DNB when they had done around $30 million in revenues. That division of DNB today has grown so significantly where it's generating on an annual basis over $1 billion in revenues. So a cool kind of turnaround story there. George had also been the EVP and CFO of Online Resources, which was an internet company back in the 1999-2000 period, that actually did an IPO for around a $300 million valuation back then, which we calculate would be somewhere north of $600 million today. A very successful company that actually had 17 of the top 50 U.S. banks as their customers. So obviously a clear market share leader. So George, welcome to the Venture to Victory podcast, and we're looking forward to learning a little bit more about you today.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, and let's start off with something fun. You don't look like you're Japanese, but you were born in Tokyo. So how did you get from birth in Tokyo to making it out to California to eventually find your way into the Silicon Valley tech community?
Yeah, I have somewhat of an interesting background. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and he attended Yale Divinity School in the 1980s. His roommate was a Japanese man, direct from Tokyo, studied in the U.S. at Yale with him. And he had a sister who was going to a small college in Nebraska. That roommate of his, the Japanese friend, was my future uncle. So through his roommate, he met my mother, and they eventually married after graduation. And then they went to Japan for 10 years or more as Presbyterian missionaries. So I'm half Japanese. I was born in Tokyo in the late 50s. And we were the only non-Asian family where Japan was not as international. And so we were the only people there that did not look exactly like everyone else. And it was an exciting period for Japan, still kind of coming out of World War II, not as international and not as sophisticated. And it was an interesting period. And Japanese was my first language.
Wow.
And, I remember my brother and sister were actually on an English speaking show where they taught English on a local TV show. Another time we went to a brand new hotel, and they were very excited to see us. This is around 1964, and our family was treated to an elaborate dinner, and they brought in all these photographers. The next day, we were on the front page of the local paper heralding the arrival of tourists for the 1964 Olympics. Although we were locals, we kept on calling
Yeah.
the locals.
Right.
And, after that, we grew up in the New York suburbs, and I had a kind of a typical childhood. I was an Eagle Scout, rode a bicycle everywhere, had a paper route, did odd jobs. I don't think that happens as much today. And also, I started to play lacrosse. We had a very good local program. We were a nationally ranked high school team. Eventually, I went to Duke University and I played on the lacrosse team there. Career-wise, I started out in finance at Deloitte, eventually morphing into sales. And then during the tech boom of 2000, I came out to Silicon Valley and was recruited by Kleiner Perkins into one of their portfolio companies.
That was in when John Doerr was the name, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Firm. Yeah.
That's really amazing. I tell you, I've had the, blessing to be able to travel to a lot of places around the world over my years. And the Japanese culture was probably most exciting to me of almost anywhere I've gone. I just found it so utterly fascinating, the way they treat people. I remember a friend of mine went over there to teach English to business executives when he was young. And he tells a story where he was on a subway coming home one night and someone had left his wallet, on the passenger seat. My friend happened to see it and get it. And he looked through it and found the address, and he thought he would return it to the person. So he tells a story how he, connected to different trains. He was relatively new, to Japan, to Tokyo. And he finally gets to the doorstep of the person's house or apartment. They open the door. He presents it to them. They looked at him, and then they just gave a nice bow and a courtesy shake and took it, and he left. And so the next day, he's teaching this class of business executives, and he's telling this story, and he's telling it in a way he's expecting to get a lot of empathy. Like, oh my God, what ingratitude. I can't believe that they just took it, accepted it, didn't do anything, didn't say anything else. And he's saying this looking for that feedback from the crowd, and it's dead still. And he just doesn't understand it. And finally, somebody raises his hand and he says, yes, what would you like to add? And he says, what were you expecting to happen? Right? Like, that's what you would do in a culture. If you found something, you would go an hour to give it back. You don't want money. You don't want tons of appreciation. You got that. But it just said a lot to me. And I had those experiences where you left your wallet at the hotel and the taxi driver just says, here's my card, come find me or send it to me. That idea of that trust in deep relationship building, it stuck with me so much. I had never seen it anywhere like I had in Japan. If you were raised in some of that environment, which it sounds like it was, and knowing you too, you seem to have a disposition that connects with that in the most positive way in terms of personality. I think that's really an amazing thing. And we're going to touch on lacrosse in D1 and D2 sports in a little bit. But before we pivot to that, I'd love to get your perspective, having looked at that arc of change over the Silicon Valley from the John Doerr days of Kleiner, which is pretty cool, all the way to where we are today. Are there any big changes or trends that you're seeing happening in the Silicon Valley right now? It could be in company formation. It could be the nature of entrepreneurship, could be the funding mechanisms, or any other general trends that you think would be worth sharing for people watching this podcast.
Tim, there are two big things that really strike me. One is the cultural shift in Silicon Valley, and the second is the amount and need for capital. With regard to culture, so I moved here in 2000, and this has probably happened to others who moved here, but it was an amazing thing to drive by every day an Apple or Google, Intel, and see these names that you'd read about and just see them in your backyard or meet their executives or staff everywhere. It's an amazing thing. So when I moved here with a sense of wonder about being at the center of innovation and at this accumulation of unbelievable human capital from around the world, the best people out here. And that has borne out to me just in an incredible way. The one thing that I think is really different is culturally, Silicon Valley, when the companies first started, going back to the Fairchild, people and Intel, there was more of an ethos of building a company for the long term and having a big idea in mind and sticking to it, and quietly in the background working on it and building something and seeing it grow and evolve over time and sticking with it. A byproduct of that might have been some level of fame or wealth or notoriety, whatever. Today, I feel like there's more of a sense of immediate gratification, which is you might have met founders where they declare that they want to create a company and then exit in 3 years and do something else.
Yeah.
Also, a little more of a Hollywood culture where people want to wear black turtlenecks and then drink Red Bull with vodka and Ashton Kutcher as an investor or Shaq or something like that. And so the shift to me has been more one of almost like purity of the entrepreneurial spirit, which is like, we're just going to build something for the sake of it and like stay with it and build something big like an Intel or whatever, versus we want a fast exit or we want to be cool or we want to be out there in the media. So that's one thing on the cultural side. With regard to capital, the advance of technology and computing power and the availability of things like AWS have lowered the barriers to creating a company. So in 2000, when I moved here with this Kleiner company, before we started building a platform, we had to go out and buy 5 million of Sun Solaris computers before we even started. We also had to pay out hundreds of thousands to Oracle for different data licenses and things like that. So we probably had to spend 10 million just before we even started coding. Today, if you're in your garage, you can go to AWS and you immediately have whatever you need. And there are any number of licenses that are just a very, very low economic level. So the barrier to actually start working on something is very, very low. So that's a big shift. You can start a company with much less capital. On the other end, I will say that the amount of capital being thrown around is humongous. And so back in the 2000 era, typical venture firm might be 150 to 200 million in a fund. That was like the very typical size. Whereas now you see routinely, there's a little slowdown right now, but $1 billion funds being raised. And even with OpenAI now, they did around somewhere in the 9 billion range on a 159 billion valuation.
Yeah.
So there's been this gargantuan shift in proportion on capital more than anything else.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's also a challenge today, right? If you follow the traditional VC model where they're looking for a couple big home runs in their portfolio, they're going to break even on a few. They'll have a couple, losses in that portfolio as well. It's much easier to have a success on a $100 million fund. Once you get to $1 billion fund, the investments have to be unless they're completely diversified, like a Series A fund. We're not talking about that. They have to have some huge hits in that portfolio in order to make that happen, which makes it more difficult to find those winners. I think you also hit on a really good point about this idea that some of the younger generation has higher expectations of things happening quicker. And I think a lot of that does tie down to the cost to start a company. So yeah, back when, I was younger, things were physical. You had physical distribution. We remember software. You had to actually make the software, buy the components. You had to ship it. And it was a cyclopedia set of documentation for how to use that. So as the velocity of all this has changed, it's made the ability to become successful much, much quicker as well. And it's not just the software product or, as you mentioned, the cost to go out and buy all these servers today. You had big workstations. Remember the Spark Sun workstations and all that infrastructure cost. Today, most stuff's in the cloud, and you can buy a cheap, powerful computer for $500 to $1,000. Your marketing team can come in, and they're not doing much physical marketing anymore, right? It's basically all through email, online, where it's digital information being shipped around. So you can do this all through providers that are outsourced and build a company on a low amount of capital. And I think that fuels this expectation of I can be successful pretty quickly. I don't need to slowly build up revenues and profits and reinvest in the same way I did before. Certainly, when we're in the information age now, businesses like SaaS businesses, fintech businesses, where it's really about just digital information and online tools, you're able to do that and build these huge valuations. And of course, the internet, above all, has allowed reach all over the world at virtually no cost. And that's driven the potential impact to create huge amounts of revenues quickly. So I don't think that's slowing down. I think as we're moving now more towards an AI world, that's going to accelerate even 10x the time it used to take. Who knows? Even this podcast, maybe one day it'll just be a script that an AI writes, and it'll study a couple videos of Tim and George. It'll produce it in 10 minutes and we'll be out ready to go. And I don't know if that's really a world that I will enjoy, because, we're human beings and we love authenticity, and there's a lot to be said. More to come on that subject. But yeah, it's definitely changed a lot, and it's going to continue to change at an even much faster pace. So let's pivot to something that's a little bit fun for me, which is this idea of how collegiate level athletes who have basically grown up, usually in most cases from the time they're young. You talked about, being a lacrosse player young, playing in college. I know you've had children involved in lacrosse and you've been coaching and mentoring people. I've got a son right now who's a really good wrestler, and I've been with him since he was 6 years old. These kids are so disciplined from the time they're young. They're used to taking criticism. They're very coachable. They are very into metrics, measuring their success and progress. And when I was one of a group of people running $1 billion company, I always looked, particularly in sales, not exclusively, but very often in sales, for people that had been D1 or D2 college athletes, because they bring that character and those traits kind of into it. Having spent so much time as athletics being a big part of your life and playing in college at Duke, what's your takeaway or opinion on that?
You see two profiles for good staff to be hired. So one is, let's just call it the super geek, highly technical person who's smarter than everybody and has the pedigree that's very attractive, whether it be from Stanford, MIT, whatever. So that's one, let's call it preferred profile, the super brainchild, whatever. So that's one very popular profile in Silicon Valley. With athletes, I see them really, really in demand in two ways. One is you see a lot of them go to Wall Street, the banking firms, also the consulting firms, and also into general management roles as well. And I think the reason that we see the favorable treatment of these athletes is that they've had to, for a long period of time, work in environments, number one, where they're with teammates all the time, working together, with spending a lot of time together, socializing and coordinating together on the field. The other thing is that 90% of their time is preparation with less gratification. So most of the time is spent practicing as opposed to playing. And it creates a sense of delayed gratification and investing before you get the yield. The other thing is that there's a huge metaphor for life in terms of preparing, succeeding, or failing. If you succeed, perhaps to succeed with grace and be a gracious victor. Mm-hmm. If you fail, to pick yourself back up, analyze maybe what could have been done better, and then to work on that for the next time. And so I think there are a lot of life lessons about working with others, getting along, preparing and investing, delaying gratification, and then being gracious when you win, or also taking lessons from losing and working on them. The other thing is there's this quality of enduring perseverance and the ability to stay with things and drive towards the long-term goal, however hard it is. Yeah. So I think those qualities are really good, particularly for banking or consulting or for general management, and also for leadership skills as well.
Yeah, I would use the word resilience because every athlete, there's always another level up, particularly when you're younger and you're coming. You think you're really great in elementary school. You go against a couple high school kids, you get wiped out. Then you go against high school and college, and it never really ends. And you do run into slumps, and you do run into periods of time where you're not rising at the level you would expect to. The psychological pressure of that and developing the resilience to overcome that over time. And I tell people all the time, I've met a lot of wrestlers I've mentored, obviously, who are in high school now, even though my son's in high school, but they just want some general guidance in life. And I tell them to think about the sport they're playing and all the things they've learned, because the same way, those are the lessons for life. And if you take that same model, that same formula that made you successful all the way up to the collegiate level, because now we're, putting a force multiplier on that, then that's the same characteristics that are going to make you successful in anything. And so as someone who runs an executive recruiting firm and places C-level candidates in these great companies, I always tell people in your LinkedIn profile, if you're a collegiate athlete, my gosh, don't just put a little side note at the very bottom of LinkedIn that you were a varsity wrestler at Iowa or a varsity starter at Penn State. I mean, it's more than a couple words. There's an entire 20-year history around your character just by being there, the same way as if you had been a Marine or you had graduated from a PhD from Stanford. There is a credential there that is so important. And I think it's really important to take those life lessons and spend a little bit of time, even in your LinkedIn profile, writing about that so people can really understand your mindset. Because for me, to make it to where you can play a sport in college, you have to have a champion mindset. It doesn't matter whether you are, a JUCO player, a D1, D2, it doesn't make a difference. Plus, so many people like yourself who are successful business people had been former athletes. And you know what that character is like. You were involved in working with teammates. And so I think when you come across potential candidates, I think talking about those issues, it definitely gives someone an edge up. And I hope they do that. But that's a lot of fun. And certainly out here, lacrosse is going crazy. It used to be that I ran into a lot of people that played lacrosse on the East Coast. I'd say the last 10 years, it's boomed. And there's some great schools out here, like your neck of the woods, SI, where my daughter went, where lacrosse is really a huge thing. And I think it's really growing. So that's a lot of fun. What I'd like to touch base on before we wrap some of this up is, since you are an advisor and you obviously are going into companies that are having some challenges, as we touched about in the pod intro, what are some recommendations that maybe you would make, or the kinds of things that you do when you go into a company that's struggling that would help those founders or the leaders of those teams recover from some of the issues they're having?
I particularly deal with venture companies and anything from an early stage all the way through maybe even a pre-IPO stage. And there are always ups and downs in these companies. And I think, number one, I think that it's a roller coaster ride. And I think that any founder or CEO just has to take in stride that it's going to be a roller coaster ride, that we just go with it. We hear a lot of talk in Silicon Valley about people bragging about, not as much anymore, but staying all night at the office and, working 7 days a week and bragging about how much code they've written and things like that. We can always hear this a lot, and people just brag about how hard they're working. I think there's more work-life balance, but probably fundamentally, there's only two things that matter in my mind. One is focusing on the right things, the top 2 to 3 issues for the company at large, and then executing on them. And so I've seen many companies where there have been former McKinsey people or Harvard MBAs or Stanford MBAs, running the company, and they would have 100 people working all day and all night. Those efforts were probably fruitless. And the reason was because there was a key issue for the company, which is they didn't have a well thought out product, and the product had not been fully tested out and vetted for customer expectations, or there wasn't a clear go-to-market strategy to get out there, or the underlying economics at a very poor level didn't work, and they were never going to make money on what they were doing. So, I'll talk to people where they say they've had a very busy morning, and if you dissect what they did, maybe none of it mattered at all.
Yeah.
Times in my career, though, where at noon I would kind of say to myself, I'm not as busy as I want to be, and I would think about, well, am I doing enough? Should I do more stuff? Make some phone calls. But let's say that morning I made one phone call to secure $10 million for the company. For that day, I earned my pay. Or let's say that on one given day, I finished a proposal that I knew I would close a massive deal on. That was enough. And so I think that it's easy to get distracted with a lot of other activities, Zoom calls, or reading Slack channels all day or something like that. I guess I would say that none of this matters. Like the founder CEO level, you've got to focus on the primary 2 to 3 things that make a difference, whether it's the product and its functionality and its customer acceptance, the go-to-market strategy, the finances of the company. There are probably 2 to 3 things that really matter and nothing else matters. And if you execute on those, you're going to be in good shape. Too often, I think, see there's a dispersion of focus, and people are probably spending maybe 80% of their time on the wrong stuff and then not executing on the important things.
I think what's so interesting about that comment is a lot of times you become so myopic in what you're doing that you're incapable of seeing that you're focusing on the wrong things. And it literally does take a group of people who may not tell you that if they're at your own company, but an outsider to come in and consult and coach. So I think, another thing I would add is it's important to ask for help, right? If you don't want to ask your board because you feel uncomfortable, someone like yourself who's been around the block, you build a relationship, you say, George, hey, you spend an hour with me and tell me, what do you think? Am I focusing on the right things? Have I become too distracted? I think it's so easy to do the things that you're really good at, that you enjoy, you can achieve success. But the things that are hard and difficult that you don't want to do. So you're a product guy and, you've started a company and you're focusing on the product, but what you should really be doing is focusing on sales and marketing and go to market, like you said, whether it's you or a team of people you're bringing in. But when you have that time, you just find yourself going back to the product because it's fun, because it's comfortable, because you're good at it. And so I think sometimes not focusing on the priorities, what the priorities are, but when you show up to work pumped and ready, someone asks you a product question and you're like, oh, I can't wait to go answer that product question. And then you realize, wow, I needed to do something else for 2 hours that would have made a difference. And there's a quote I had heard on a podcast somewhere, and it's become my kind of quote at the top of my to-do list. And it goes something like, the magic you're looking for is in the hard work you're avoiding. And I think that's a part of the problem. And sometimes you need a good old kick in the butt, whether it comes from an outside advisor, from someone at your company you trust, a board member, your wife, your kids, to just tell you, hey, you've really got to focus on this one thing you don't really want to, but that's where the magic, that's where the money, that's where the success is in. So, yeah. So my advice is, find somebody like George out there who's been around the block, who's had a diversity of experiences, who's gone through the ups and the downs and the .com issue and the 2008 issue, who really understands what it's like to be an entrepreneur. You understand it on the ground floor because you bring a finance background. So when these companies are having these troubles, you're the one who's really, looking at the microscope and really trying to figure out where are some of these inherent issues we can change. And a lot of times people are focused on growth, can't see that, but at the moment, that's what's really important. So it's really been awesome having you on the podcast today. Where can people find you? That's the most important. Is there an email address? Is there a place you show up on social media, LinkedIn? What's the best way for them to find you and say, George, help me out. I'm reaching out and I need some of that magic that I've been avoiding.
Thanks so much. It's been so great to talk today and to also hear your commentary, which is so skilled. And, I have a LinkedIn profile, George Northup. You can find it easily. And then separately, my email is gnorthup@gmail.com. And I basically will respond to everybody who contacts me. And my goal is to work with entrepreneurs who I find energizing and to help them succeed.
Well, I'll tell you one thing from having known you for a while, in addition to being really good, in addition to having such a wonderful perspective that goes back over many decades, is that you are really a nice person to work with and to be friends with. I mean, if you're going to work with someone, it's fun to look forward to the meeting, to look forward to showing up with them every day. And I know every meeting we've ever had, George, as we have always said, I can't believe it's been, an hour, because we could probably talk for 5 hours and never know the time had passed. And that's just an added benefit. So that's awesome. You get to be a certain age where you get to hang out with the people you want to hang out with. We're both there. And I certainly hope people got value out of this and will reach out to you if they have the need, George. And we'll go from there.
Thank you so much. It's been great to spend time with you.
Awesome. And that's a wrap for today. Cheers, everyone.
The Venture to Victory podcast is provided by MatchStar Venture Search. If you're interested in any of our open executive roles or need help sourcing world-class talent for your company, check out our website at matchstar.com.